May 5th, 1891, 57th Street and 7th Avenue. 6 in the morning. The sun hasn't cleared the tenements, and the city wraps itself in coal smoke and fog. Inside a fortress of Roman brick and terracotta, before a single note has been played, before Tchaikovsky raises his baton, before 2,800 bodies fill the velvet seats, the walls already know their secret. Oak paneling from Appalachian forests where loggers earned $1 a day and died in accidents nobody recorded. Italian marble quarried in Carrara by men who breathed stone dust until their lungs turned to concrete, then polished in New Jersey by immigrants earning 70 cents a day. Wrought iron balustrades forged in Pennsylvania furnaces where Carnegie's workers lost fingers to molten steel, where temperatures reached 130 degrees, where men collapsed from heat stroke every summer. And above it all, suspended like a crown, an elliptical ceiling designed with such mathematical precision that it captures sound waves, bends them, redirects them, so that a whisper from center stage reaches the fifth-tier balcony as clearly as a shout. Andrew Carnegie built a temple to beauty with money earned from fire, blood, and broken bodies working 12-hour shifts in his mills. Was this redemption or just expensive guilt? The mathematics were clean, simple, brutally elegant. By 1890, Carnegie Steel Corporation produced more steel than all of Britain combined, one company outproducing an empire. The Homestead Works alone employed 3,800 men working 12-hour shifts in conditions that would be illegal a generation later. Summer temperatures near the furnaces reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Men fainted on the factory floor from heat exhaustion. Some died. The company would drag them out, hose down the floor, and keep the line running. Winter offered no central heating except what radiated from the furnaces themselves, creating zones of infernal heat and bitter cold within the same building. They earned between $1.40 and $2.50 per day, depending on skill level. A skilled puddler stirring molten iron at 2,800 degrees might make $2.50 on a good day. But that required working next to open crucibles, breathing air thick with coal dust and metal particles, risking burns, blindness, and death every hour of every shift. An unskilled laborer hauling pig iron earned $1.40. For 12 hours, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, no vacation, no sick days, no compensation if injured, no pension if you survive to old age. Meanwhile, Carnegie's personal income that year exceeded $25 million. Not the company's profit, his personal cut after all expenses. He could have paid every worker double their wages, tripled them even, and still cleared $20 million in profit. The mathematics were simple. He chose not to. Instead, he spent $2 million building a concert hall in Manhattan where orchestra seats would cost $3, more than most workers earned in 2 days, in a neighborhood where his furnace workers would be turned away at the door for wearing work clothes. The contradiction didn't escape everyone. When Carnegie announced plans for his music hall in 1887, union leaders in Pittsburgh wrote letters asking why he invested millions in cultural institutions for Manhattan's elite, while his workers lived in company housing with outdoor privies shared by multiple families and roofs that leaked when it rained. The letters went unanswered, all of them. Carnegie was in Scotland, summering at Skibo Castle, dictating essays to secretaries in rooms heated by Scottish peat fires. It was during this period that Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth, an essay that would establish him as America's leading philosopher of philanthropy. In it, he argued with evangelical fervor that rich men had not just an opportunity, but a moral duty to spend their fortunes on public good before they died. The wealthy, Carnegie wrote, were merely trustees of their wealth, temporary custodians with a responsibility to use their money to elevate society. Libraries, so the poor could educate themselves. Universities, so promising students could study. concert halls so working people could experience beauty. But the essay never mentioned wages, never suggested that public good might begin with paying the men who created the wealth, never proposed that building libraries might be less moral than ensuring workers could afford food and medical care for their families. The omission was telling. Carnegie believed in trickle-down culture. The wealthy would create institutions, and everyone would benefit eventually. Meanwhile, his workers ate beans and cabbage, while he hired European chefs at Skybow Castle. The architect chosen for the project was William Burnet Toothill, a man whose qualifications were unusual. He was a cellist first, an architect second. He designed houses in Manhattan, a few commercial buildings, nothing approaching this scale or complexity. He had no experience with concert hall acoustics, no portfolio of cultural institutions. What he had was an obsession with sound, with how it moved through space, how it could be shaped and controlled through architectural design. Carnegie didn't hire him for experience. He hired him because Toothill understood what was needed. Acoustics so perfect they would make New York's cultural establishment forget where the money came from. Acoustics that would transform violence into beauty, exploitation into art. Toothill spent 2 years traveling Europe on Carnegie's money, measuring ceiling curves in Vienna's Musikverein, testing materials in Berlin's Philharmonie, calculating angles in London's Royal Albert Hall. He filled notebooks with equations, sketches, observations about reflection and absorption and resonance. He consulted with acousticians, architects, musicians, anyone who might help him understand how to build a space where sound could exist in its purest form. He returned with plans for a shoebox-shaped auditorium with plaster walls backed by hollow terracotta tiles, a design borrowed from ancient Roman amphitheaters and adapted for orchestral music. The shape would reflect sound waves without distortion, without dead zones, without acoustic shadows. Plaster walls would reflect high frequencies. Hollow terracotta tiles would absorb low frequencies. The ceiling would curve in a specific ellipse to focus sound toward the audience. Every surface angle mattered. Every material choice was deliberate. Every seat would hear equally. Democracy through engineering, funded by oligarchy. Construction began in 1889 on land Carnegie purchased for $1 million, roughly 3 years of combined wages for his entire homestead workforce. The site had been a streetcar depot, before that a livery stable, before that farmland owned by Dutch settlers. Now it would become the anchor of what Carnegie envisioned as a cultural district to rival anything in Paris or Vienna. The foundation alone required 2,000 cubic yards of concrete mixed on site by laborers earning $1, 25 per day, working 10 hours in weather that ranged from frozen January winds to sweltering August humidity. The concrete had to cure properly, or the whole building would settle unevenly, destroying Toothill's acoustic calculations. The workers didn't know that. They just mixed and poured and smoothed, trusting that someone above them understood what mattered. The exterior walls used 4 million bricks, each one laid by hand by immigrant Italian masons, working 10-hour days for $2.50. These men were artists in their way, fitting each brick so precisely that the mortar lines aligned perfectly across 5 stories. The bricks came from New Jersey kilns, the mortar from Pennsylvania lime pits, the water from the Croton Aqueduct. Carnegie owned stock in the brick company and shares in the lime operation. The city provided the water for free, part of New York's commitment to supporting cultural development. The terracotta ornaments came from workshops in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, where artisans trained in European traditions molded clay into elaborate flourishes and classical motifs. The work demanded precision and artistry. The pay was $3 per day, triple what Carnegie's furnace workers earned, but these men would never see their work installed, would never attend a performance in the building they helped create. Inside, the real expense began. The main auditorium required 50,000 square feet of oak paneling, enough to floor 60 typical Manhattan apartments. Each piece had to be hand-selected from Appalachian forests, hand-cut to exact specifications, hand-fitted to walls and ceilings. The wood came from forests in West Virginia and Tennessee, where logging crews earned $1.25 per day, working 14-hour shifts. Then the rough lumber traveled to workshops in New York, where skilled carpenters earning $3 per day transformed raw planks into tongue and groove paneling. The irony compounded with every nail driven. Men who would never afford a ticket to Carnegie Hall were building a palace for people who would never meet them, would never know their names. The seats were upholstered in red velvet imported from France. The lighting fixtures were bronze, cast in Pennsylvania foundries. Even the nails were custom-made, forged to specifications that required heads to sit flush with the wood grain, invisible unless you knew where to look. Toot Hill's acoustic design depended on precision measured in fractions of inches. The ceiling curved in a specific ellipse, mathematically calculated to focus sound toward the audience. Every curve mattered. Every angle had to match architectural drawings exactly, or the acoustic properties would fail. The rear wall angled at precisely 12 degrees from vertical, enough to redirect sound waves forward without creating echoes. The side balconies jutted forward in measured increments, positioned to eliminate acoustic dead zones. Workers installed hollow chambers behind the plaster walls, empty spaces that would absorb low frequencies while reflecting high notes. Construction foremen conducted tests before the building was complete, bringing in musicians to play in the empty shell, listening for problems, adjusting surfaces where sound behaved unexpectedly. They discovered the design worked almost too well. Conversations in the basement could be heard in the fifth-tier balcony. A drop tool on stage sounded like a gunshot. The building amplified everything, which meant every performance would need to be executed with care. But there was a problem nobody mentioned publicly. The timeline was brutal. Carnegie wanted the hall ready for the 1891 spring season, giving workers just 18 months to complete what should have been a 3-year project. The schedule was impossible, which meant corners had to be cut, workers had to be pushed beyond safe limits, accidents were inevitable. There are no official records of construction deaths, but newspaper archives from the period mention at least 4. 2 men fell from scaffolding, one was killed when a hoist cable snapped, another died from heat stroke. The deaths merited single paragraphs in papers that devoted full pages to describing the building's magnificence. The families received $100 each and signed papers agreeing not to pursue legal action. $100, roughly 40 days' wages. That was the price of a life in Carnegie's cultural calculus. Meanwhile, Carnegie was in Europe, curating the opening season from London and Paris. He wanted stars. He wanted names that would legitimize the whole instantly. He wanted Tchaikovsky. The Russian composer was world-famous, expensive, difficult, and exactly what Carnegie needed. The negotiation took months. Tchaikovsky initially refused, citing health, fear of seasickness, and dislike of public attention. Carnegie persisted, emphasizing the historical importance, the opportunity to introduce his music to American audiences. Tchaikovsky remained unconvinced. Finally, Carnegie did what he always did when persuasion failed. He doubled the money. The original offer had been $250. Carnegie raised it to $2,500, plus all travel expenses. At those terms, Tchaikovsky agreed, though his letters reveal continued dread about the journey. By April 1891, Carnegie Hall was nearly complete. The exterior was finished, terracotta ornaments installed, windows glazed. Inside, workers raced to complete final details, hanging lighting fixtures, installing seats, finishing backstage spaces, testing mechanical systems. The opening was scheduled for May 5th. Invitations had been sent to 2,800 guests, New York's wealthiest families, the people Carnegie needed to impress if his hall was going to establish itself as the center of cultural life. Everything depended on that first night, on the acoustics working as designed, on Tchaikovsky delivering a memorable performance. May 5th arrived cold and damp, typical spring weather in Manhattan. Outside Carnegie Hall, crowds gathered on 57th Street by afternoon. Not ticket holders, but workers, immigrants, street vendors, curious New Yorkers who wanted to see the building everyone had discussed for 2 years. These were the people Carnegie claimed to be helping with his philanthropy, the masses who would benefit from exposure to great music and high culture. But they weren't inside. They stood behind police barriers, watching the wealthy arrive in carriages, watching diamonds and silk and top hats parade past them into the warmth of the lobby. Inside, 2,800 people filled every seat, every box, every standing space. The hall glowed with electric light, still a novelty in 1891. The wealthy wore their finest, men in white tie and tails, women in gowns that cost more than Carnegie's workers earned in a year. The Carnegie family occupied the central box, positioned where everyone could see them, where Andrew could receive congratulations, accept praise for his cultural generosity. He played the role perfectly, modest, gracious, deflecting credit, though notably he deflected less credit to the workers than to the architect. Tchaikovsky took the podium at 8:15 p.m. The chatter died immediately. The composer was smaller than people expected, nervous, uncomfortable with attention. But when he raised his baton and the orchestra struck the opening chords of his Marcia Solennelle, something happened that Tutil had predicted but couldn't guarantee until that moment. The sound filled the hall perfectly, not louder in front than back, not muddy or shrill, just clear, balanced, present, every instrument distinct, every phrase alive. People described it as hearing music for the first time. The New York Times wrote that Carnegie Hall possessed acoustic superiority to any hall in Europe or America. Critics agreed that something remarkable had been created. Tutil had delivered. Carnegie had achieved what he wanted. Culture had been purchased, legacy secured. But at what price? Not the financial price, which was substantial but manageable for a man of Carnegie's wealth. The real price. The human cost that was never calculated, never acknowledged, never included in the celebratory press coverage. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. Total construction cost, $1, $2 million in 1891 dollars, equivalent to roughly $40 million today when adjusted for inflation and purchasing power. Carnegie's annual income during the construction period, $25 million per year. Time required for Carnegie to earn the hall's total cost, 17 days of passive income from steel operations he didn't personally oversee. Meanwhile, at the Homestead Works, 3,800 workers collectively earned approximately $4 million per year. It would have taken them 3 months of combined wages to equal what Carnegie spent on oak paneling and marble and terracotta ornaments. 3 months of every worker's salary just for the finishes. Another way to think about it, Carnegie could have given every homestead worker a 20% raise, improving their quality of life substantially, and the cost would have been less than he spent on the concert hall's acoustic design. The contradiction deepened 1 year later, July 1892. Carnegie was in Scotland when his partner, Henry Clay Frick, ordered a lockout at Homestead. Workers had been negotiating for modest wage increases. Frick responded by hiring 300 Pinkerton guards armed with rifles. On July 6th before dawn, the guards arrived by river barge. Workers met them at the shore. What followed was a 14-hour gun battle. 10 men died, 7 workers, 3 Pinkertons. Dozens were wounded. Carnegie sent telegrams supporting Frick's decisions. No record exists of him expressing regret. The strike was broken by state militia. Wages were cut, the union destroyed. Workers returned under worse conditions. Editorial cartoons showed Carnegie conducting while workers bled beneath the stage. Labor papers called the hall a monument to stolen wages. Carnegie never responded. Instead, he increased his giving, funding libraries across America. The message was clear. He would be remembered as a benefactor, not an industrialist. The concert hall would outlive the factory. For the next 68 years, Carnegie Hall operated roughly as Carnegie had envisioned, a cultural institution serving primarily wealthy patrons with occasional cheaper seats available to the middle class during less prestigious performances. A place where the greatest musicians of each generation performed and added to the hall's growing prestige. The roster reads like a history of classical music. Rachmaninoff premiered here. Mahler conducted his own symphonies. Toscanini made this his American home. Gershwin introduced jazz-influenced composition. Horowitz gave legendary recitals. Duke Ellington brought jazz to the same stage that had hosted Tchaikovsky. Billie Holiday sang here. Leonard Bernstein conducted. Maria Callas sang. Each performance added another layer to the hall's cultural significance, each artist another brick in the wall of prestige that protected the building from questions about its origins. But the building itself began showing its age in ways that money and prestige couldn't hide. By the 1940s, the terracotta ornaments were cracking in freeze-thaw cycles that New York winters guaranteed. The oak paneling was drying out, splitting along grain lines that hadn't been properly sealed during original installation. The heating system, designed for coal-burning boilers, struggled to adapt to oil and later to natural gas, creating temperature fluctuations that damaged instrument tuning and audience comfort simultaneously. The plumbing was failing, original pipes corroding, joints leaking, bathrooms flooding during heavy use. Maintenance costs were rising while revenue stayed relatively flat, creating a financial pressure that made the building vulnerable in ways Carnegie had never anticipated. The neighborhood had changed too. When Carnegie Hall opened in 1891, 57th Street was transitioning from residential to cultural, but it was still primarily low-rise buildings, a human-scaled environment where a 5-story concert hall could dominate the visual landscape. By the 1950s, Midtown Manhattan was transforming into a canyon of skyscrapers, office towers climbing 30 and 40 stories, glass and steel replacing brick and terracotta, modern efficiency displacing architectural ornamentation. Carnegie Hall suddenly looked small, dated, economically inefficient. The land it occupied was worth more than the cultural function it served, at least by the cold mathematics of real estate development. The crisis became acute in 1955, when the New York Philharmonic, Carnegie Hall's most important and reliable tenant, announced plans to move to a new concert space at Lincoln Center. The Philharmonic had been the hall's anchor tenant for decades, guaranteeing a certain number of performances, drawing subscribers, filling seats during slow periods. Without the Philharmonic, Carnegie Hall's financial model became uncertain. Subscription revenue would drop. The hall would need to book more one-off performances, rely more heavily on rental income, compete with newer venues that had better backstage facilities and modern amenities. The building's owner, Robert E. Simon Jr., loved the building, but was also a businessman. He tried to find buyers who would preserve the hall. Every serious offer came with demolition plans. The most aggressive came in 1956. A developer wanted a 40-story office tower. The land was worth $5 million. A modern building could generate $2 million in annual rent. Carnegie Hall generated $400,000 with costs of $350,000. Profit, $50,000. The building was worth more dead than alive. Demolition permits were filed in 1959. The wrecking ball was scheduled for January 1960. The news triggered resistance. Violinist Isaac Stern, who had performed at Carnegie Hall dozens of times and understood its acoustics better than any architect, started making phone calls. He called conductors, soloists, composers, wealthy patrons, historians and critics. The message was simple. This building cannot be allowed to disappear. The acoustics cannot be replicated. The history matters. We have to fight. Within weeks, Stern had organized a coalition that included Leonard Bernstein, conductor of the New York Philharmonic, Richard Rodgers, the Broadway composer, Jacob Javits, U.S. Senator from New York, and dozens of other musicians, politicians, historians, and preservationists. They held emergency meetings, lobbied politicians, raised money, and generated press coverage. But they faced a fundamental problem. New York City in 1959 had no legal mechanism to prevent private demolition. There was no landmarks preservation law, no historical commission, no official process for designating buildings as culturally significant. Property rights were nearly absolute. The developers owned Carnegie Hall. They had legal right to demolish it. Stern's coalition had passion and publicity, but no legal authority. The solution came from an unlikely source. Mayor Robert Wagner, a Democrat known more for pragmatic machine politics than cultural preservation, a mayor who'd built his career on construction projects and generally sided with real estate interests. But Wagner had been getting letters, hundreds of them, from voters who wanted Carnegie Hall saved. Not just wealthy patrons, but middle-class families from Queens and Brooklyn, music teachers from the Bronx, musicians from Staten Island, people who understood that some things mattered more than office space. Wagner saw political opportunity in cultural preservation, a chance to position himself as someone who understood that cities needed history as much as development. In April 1960, just months before demolition was scheduled to begin, Wagner pushed emergency legislation through City Council, allowing New York to purchase Carnegie Hall for $5 million using a combination of city funds and state bonds. The legislation also created a non-profit corporation to manage the building, keeping it off city books while ensuring public oversight. The council debate was heated. Development-friendly members argued that $5 million was too much for a deteriorating concert hall when the city needed schools and hospitals. Preservation advocates countered that losing Carnegie Hall would mark New York as a city that valued profit over culture. The vote was close, but it passed. The wrecking ball stopped. Carnegie Hall survived by weeks. But survival came with significant compromise. The city couldn't afford full restoration. The $5 million purchase price exhausted available funds. The building would be preserved but not improved, maintained but not renovated, kept alive but not made healthy. For the next 18 years, Carnegie Hall operated in slowly declining condition. Paint peeling in backstage hallways, seats breaking in upper balconies, plumbing failing in bathrooms, ventilation systems struggling, water stains spreading across plaster ceilings. Performers complained, quietly at first, and then more publicly as conditions worsened. Dressing rooms leaked when it rained. Heating was unreliable, leaving some rooms freezing while others overheated. The loading dock was too small for modern equipment trucks. Backstage storage was inadequate. The acoustics remained perfect, the one element nobody could criticize, but everything else was deteriorating in ways that made performances increasingly difficult to stage. By the mid-1970s, the building was dying slowly, saved from demolition but not from neglect. The non-profit managing the hall lacked resources for major repairs. The city wasn't providing additional funding. Revenue from performances covered operating costs but left nothing for capital improvements. The turning point came in 1978 when Isaac Stern, who had led the fight to save the building 18 years earlier, was elected chairman of the Carnegie Hall Corporation Board. Stern announced an ambitious goal: raise $60 million for complete renovation, $60 million in 1978 money. The goal seemed impossible, but Stern understood something about cultural philanthropy. People don't give to buildings, they give to legacies. The campaign took 8 years, from 1978 to 1986. Money came from benefit concerts, corporate sponsorships, government grants, and wealthy donors who wanted their names remembered alongside Carnegie's. Fundraising plateaued multiple times. Stern had to restart momentum repeatedly, but gradually the total climbed. $10 million, then $20 million, finally reaching $60 million in early 1986. Work began immediately. The restoration was meticulous. The team studied Tuthill's original drawings, matching 1890s materials and techniques with 1980s precision. They replaced 400 cracked terracotta ornaments with replicas cast from surviving pieces. They stripped all 50,000 square feet of oak paneling, repaired damaged sections, refinished the entire surface, and reinstalled it precisely as originally configured. They completely rebuilt heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. They upgraded electrical wiring, modernized plumbing, improved accessibility with elevators and ramps. They reinforced structural supports in the foundation, but they touched nothing that affected acoustics. Nothing. Every curve, every angle, every hollow chamber, every surface treatment remained exactly as Tuthill designed. The restoration team understood that Carnegie Hall's value came from its sound, that any change to acoustic properties could destroy what made the building worth preserving. The restoration took 4 years and cost $55 million, nearly 50 times what Carnegie had spent to build it originally. Carnegie Hall reopened in December 1986 with a gala concert attended by the same mix of wealthy patrons and classical music enthusiasts who had filled the hall for 95 years. Critics declared it more beautiful than ever, and they were right by most measurable standards. The red velvet seats were brighter, new fabric replacing material worn thin by decades of use. The bronze fixtures gleamed, polished to mirror finish. The terracotta ornaments looked as sharp as they had in 1891, minus the coal smoke and urban grime. The oak paneling glowed under new lighting. It looked like 1891 again, minus the uncomfortable realities of 19th-century labor that had paid for the original construction. The restoration won awards from architectural preservation societies and cultural institutions. It was studied as a model for how to restore historic buildings while adapting them for contemporary use. Attendance soared, reaching capacity most nights. Carnegie Hall was saved, truly saved this time, protected by landmark designation laws passed since the 1960 crisis, funded by an endowment that could support ongoing maintenance, operated by a corporation that understood both its historical significance and operational requirements. But questions remained, uncomfortable questions that the restoration hadn't addressed because they weren't architectural problems. What had been saved, exactly? A building, certainly. An acoustic achievement, absolutely. A monument to Gilded Age ambition and artistic aspiration, yes. But what about the legacy underneath? The labor that had built these walls? The workers who had died during construction? The furnace workers whose wages had funded Carnegie's philanthropy? The men and women whose names appeared nowhere in the building they had created? The renovation plaques installed throughout the restored Carnegie Hall thanked donors by name. They thanked the restoration team, architects and engineers and craftsmen whose work had preserved the building. They thanked politicians who had supported funding. They thanked corporations whose sponsorships had made restoration possible. They mentioned Carnegie as founder, Tuthill as architect, Tchaikovsky as opening night conductor. They celebrated Isaac Stern's preservation efforts with a permanent exhibition in the Rose Museum. But nowhere did they mention Homestead. Nowhere did they name the workers who had laid 4 million bricks. Nowhere did they acknowledge the men who had died during construction, the specific individuals whose deaths merited only single paragraphs in newspapers. Nowhere did they calculate the human cost of the fortune that had built the hall. Nowhere did they mention the 12-hour shifts in 130-degree heat, the wages that barely supported families, the conditions that killed workers while generating profits that funded culture. This isn't unusual in how America preserves history. It's the standard approach, actually. We preserve buildings while erasing the labor that created them. We celebrate architects while forgetting workers. We honor donors while ignoring the source of their wealth. Grand Central Terminal is a landmark protected by law, photographed by millions, recognized globally. The men who died building its tunnels, who drowned in flooded caissons while excavating beneath the East River, who fell from scaffolding while raising its ceiling, are footnotes in specialized histories read by almost nobody. The Brooklyn Bridge is an icon, one of the most photographed structures in America. The workers who died in its construction, including its chief engineer, are commemorated in a small plaque most visitors never notice. Carnegie Hall follows this pattern. It's a cultural treasure, a national historic landmark, protected and preserved and celebrated. The steel workers who funded it through their labor, who generated the profits that Carnegie converted into philanthropy, remain invisible. We celebrate the legacy of philanthropists while forgetting the cost of their philanthropy. We admire monuments while erasing memory. The mathematics haven't changed. Carnegie earned $475 million during his lifetime, equivalent to roughly $14 billion today, when adjusted for both inflation and the relative value of wealth across different economic periods. He gave away $350 million, funding 2,509 public libraries, 7,689 church organs, and numerous universities, concert halls, and cultural institutions. His foundation still operates, still distributes grants, still carries his name into the 21st century. But he also created and maintained working conditions that killed hundreds and injured thousands. His factories had accident rates that were high even by the standards of an era when industrial safety barely existed as a concept. He fought unions with private armies. He cut wages during economic downturns while maintaining his own lifestyle. He wrote essays about the moral duty of the wealthy while paying workers poverty wages. And when workers at Homestead demanded modest improvements, he authorized his business partner to hire Pinkerton guards who shot strikers. His reputation as a benefactor has outlasted his reputation as an industrialist. Most Americans know Carnegie for libraries, not for labor violence, for concert halls, not for factory conditions, for philanthropy, not for Homestead. The names carved in marble on public buildings have survived longer than the names in cemetery records where steel workers were buried. Carnegie Hall remains his most visible monument, a building that announces his cultural contribution every time an orchestra performs. Today, Carnegie Hall operates as a non-profit corporation with an annual budget of $104 million. It hosts approximately 250 performances each year across its 3 venues: the main Stern Auditorium seating 2,804, the smaller Zankel Hall seating 599, and the intimate Weil Recital Hall seating 268. Total annual attendance reaches approximately 650,000 people, a diverse mix of subscribers who've held season tickets for decades, single-ticket buyers seeking specific performances, tourists visiting New York who want to experience a cultural landmark, and students attending educational programs at reduced rates. Ticket prices reflect the building's position as a premium cultural venue serving audiences who can afford premium prices. Orchestra center seats for major performances cost between $250 and $350. Side orchestra and front mezzanine seats run $150 to $250. Upper levels and balcony seats range from $50 to $150, making them accessible to middle-class audiences willing to sit farther from the stage. The cheapest seats, tucked away in the 5th tier, far from the stage, start at $25, but offer the same acoustically perfect experience as Orchestra Center, proving that Toot Hill's design succeeded in creating democratic access to sound even within an economically stratified space. The average ticket price across all performances is approximately $85. The median household income in the surrounding neighborhood is $142,000, more than double the national median, meaning that Carnegie Hall remains largely accessible to those who can afford both the tickets and the lifestyle they represent, just as it was in 1891, when furnace workers earning $1.50 per day couldn't dream of attending. The building has been designated a National Historic Landmark, the highest level of recognition for cultural significance. It's protected from demolition by multiple overlapping layers of legal protection: City Landmark Designation, State Historical Registry, Federal Landmark Status, and its non-profit status, which prevents sale for redevelopment. The acoustics remain exactly as Toot Hill designed them, unchanged after 133 years, still considered the finest in America by most musicians who've performed in multiple venues, still capable of making whispers audible in the furthest balcony. Musicians still describe playing at Carnegie Hall as different from performing anywhere else, as a transformative experience that goes beyond mere acoustics. The sound doesn't just project outward from the stage, they say. It envelops both performer and audience, creating an intimate connection despite the hall's size. Every note resonates in ways that make hearing your own playing revelatory, as though the building itself is participating in the performance, responding to every phrase, amplifying every dynamic shift. Orchestral musicians report being able to hear sections they normally can't distinguish. Solo performers describe feeling as though they're playing inside a perfectly tuned instrument. Conductors say the hall responds to their smallest gestures, translating minute variations in tempo or dynamics into audible differences that reach the furthest balcony. Audiences report similar experiences that transcend technical explanation. Music heard in Carnegie Hall sounds somehow more present, more immediate, more emotionally affecting than the same performance would sound elsewhere, even when performed by the same musicians playing the same pieces. Whether this is pure acoustic reality, the result of Toot Hill's mathematical precision in designing sound-reflective surfaces, or whether it's partly cultural mythology, the accumulated weight of 133 years of legendary performances creating expectations that shape perception is debatable. But the consistency of testimony across generations of musicians and concert-goers, spanning different musical genres and cultural backgrounds, suggests Toot Hill achieved something genuinely rare, something that can't be easily replicated despite modern technology and computer-aided acoustic modeling. The oak paneling that workers installed for 70 cents a day still gleams under lights powered by electrical systems those same workers could never have imagined and certainly couldn't have afforded to use in their own homes. The bronze fixtures cast in Pennsylvania, foundries shine under bulbs that didn't exist when the hall was built. The building works, still functions as designed, still serves its intended purpose, still draws crowds who come to hear music in a space engineered for acoustic perfection. But there's another number worth considering, a calculation that reveals how little has changed in the fundamental economic equation that built Carnegie Hall. In 1891, Andrew Carnegie spent $2 million on a concert hall, while his workers earned $1.50 per day. The ratio between Carnegie's cultural spending and worker wages was approximately 1/300,000 to 1. In 2024, America's wealthiest individuals spend billions on vanity projects, space tourism, super yachts, personal museums, and art collections, while millions of Americans work multiple jobs at wages that haven't kept pace with inflation for 4 decades. The median American worker earns approximately $60,000 per year. America's 10 wealthiest individuals collectively spend tens of billions annually on personal projects. The ratio has increased. The mechanisms have changed. We have labor laws, minimum wages, workplace safety regulations, unions in some sectors, legal protections Carnegie's workers never had. But the fundamental equation persists. We still build monuments to generosity with money extracted from labor. We still celebrate philanthropists while ignoring the workers who made their wealth possible. Carnegie Hall survived demolition because enough people believed cultural landmarks matter more than profit maximization. They were right. The building's preservation represents a rare victory of cultural values over market forces. But the story of its survival is incomplete without acknowledging why it needed saving in the first place. Because American capitalism values real estate more than history, profit more than preservation, development more than legacy, always and automatically, unless communities organize to resist. We nearly lost Carnegie Hall because a 40-story office building made more financial sense than a concert hall. The building survived because musicians and activists fought for it. Because Isaac Stern spent decades advocating for preservation, because Mayor Wagner saw political advantage in cultural protection, because enough wealthy donors contributed to restoration. Not because the economic system valued it. The market wanted demolition. Culture demanded preservation. This time, culture won. Most times, it doesn't. The restoration of Carnegie Hall cost $55 million. During the same period, from 1986 to 1990, New York City demolished approximately 200 architecturally significant buildings because no coalition formed to save them, because they lacked famous advocates, because they weren't culturally prestigious enough to generate newspaper coverage, because they were in the wrong neighborhoods or served the wrong communities or simply weren't lucky enough to have someone like Isaac Stern fighting for them. Carnegie Hall survived because it was famous, because it had powerful advocates, because it represented high culture that wealthy donors valued enough to fund. Other buildings disappeared quietly, their histories erased, their contributions forgotten, their stories lost except in archives nobody reads. We preserve the landmarks of the wealthy while erasing the landmarks of everyone else. We protect concert halls, but not union halls. We designate mansions as historic, but let worker housing crumble. We celebrate cultural institutions while demolishing community centers. The preservation system itself reflects the same inequalities that built these structures originally. Which buildings we save reveals what we value. Carnegie Hall was worth $55 million to restore. How many community centers could have been saved for that amount? How many public schools? How many affordable housing units? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're choices made explicit through budget allocations. Walk through Carnegie Hall today and you'll see plaques everywhere honoring donors, musicians, architects, administrators, and preservationists. You'll see photographs documenting the building's history, opening night with Tchaikovsky, legendary performances by Horowitz and Callas and Bernstein, the demolition crisis of 1960, the restoration of the 1980s. You'll see architectural drawings showing Toothill's acoustic design. You'll see the original blueprints preserved behind glass. You'll see a timeline of performances spanning 133 years. But you won't see photographs of the men who laid the bricks, who installed the oak panels, who forged the iron balustrades, who mixed the concrete, who carried materials, who worked the construction sites. You won't see their names or their wages or their working conditions. You won't see documentation of the deaths that occurred during construction. You won't see acknowledgement of the homestead workers whose labor funded the building. They built the hall, their labor paid for it, their sacrifice made it possible, but they're not part of its official history. They've been erased from the story we tell about how Carnegie Hall came to exist. This erasure is intentional. or at least it's deliberate through omission. America's great cultural institutions prefer clean narratives that are easier to market and simpler to celebrate. Visionary philanthropists identify a need. Brilliant architects design a solution. Talented performers populate the space. Generous donors fund preservation. Appreciative audiences fill the seats. That story is clean, inspiring, suitable for promotional materials and fundraising appeals. It's also incomplete. The complete story requires acknowledging where Carnegie's money came from, which means acknowledging homestead, which means acknowledging exploitation, which means confronting the fundamental inequality that made Gilded Age philanthropy possible, which makes the story complicated and uncomfortable and harder to use in marketing materials. So, the erasure continues. We preserve the building but simplify its history. We honor the philanthropist but forget the workers. We celebrate the monument but ignore the cost. The question Carnegie Hall forces us to confront, the question we'd rather avoid, is whether beauty built on suffering can ever be truly beautiful without acknowledging the suffering. Can we separate the music from the money that made it possible? Can we celebrate the acoustics while condemning the working conditions that funded them? Can we appreciate architectural achievement while mourning the lives it cost? Or does acknowledging the full truth diminish our enjoyment, complicate our relationship with spaces we love, force us to hold contradictions that are easier to ignore? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're practical questions about how we remember history, what we choose to preserve, whose stories we tell. If we only teach the triumphant narrative, we erase half the truth. If we only emphasize exploitation, we miss the complexity of what actually happened. The honest approach requires holding both truths simultaneously. Carnegie Hall is an architectural masterpiece, and it was built with money earned through labor practices that killed workers. The acoustics are perfect, and workers who created them died during construction. The building deserved preservation, and so did the memory of the people who built it. Carnegie believed his philanthropy would redeem his industrial practices. He wrote extensively about the duty of the rich to give back, to use their fortunes for public benefit, to create institutions that would outlast their lifetimes. But giving back implies you took something first. And what Carnegie took was lives. Workers burned alive in furnace accidents, crushed by machinery, killed by exhaustion, shot by company guards during strikes. His libraries and concert halls and universities were funded by their sacrifice, built with their labor, made possible by their suffering. Does that make these buildings monuments to culture or tombstones marking where workers' dreams were buried? The preservation of Carnegie Hall answered one critical question. Cultural landmarks are worth saving even when market forces demand their destruction. That's important. That victory matters. It established precedent. It showed that communities can organize successfully against development pressure. It demonstrated that culture has value beyond rental income calculations. These are real achievements that enabled the preservation of hundreds of buildings in subsequent decades. But preservation didn't answer the harder question: how do we save buildings honestly while acknowledging their full cost? How do we preserve architecture while honoring the workers who built it? How do we celebrate achievement while recognizing exploitation? How do we hold memory honestly without sanitizing history for marketing purposes? These questions matter because Carnegie Hall isn't unique. Every historic building has a hidden history. Every monument was built by someone whose name wasn't carved in marble. Every legacy has a cost that wasn't calculated in the budget. In 2015, Carnegie Hall opened a small exhibition in its Rose Museum, documenting the building's construction with more completeness than previous exhibitions. The display includes photographs of workers at the construction site, sample materials showing brick and terracotta and oak, construction timelines indicating how quickly the building was completed, and importantly, wage records showing what different workers earned. It's a meaningful step toward fuller disclosure, toward acknowledging the human labor that created the building. But the exhibition is small, occupying one corner of one room in the museum. It's optional, easy to miss if you're not looking for it, visited by a fraction of the people who attend performances. The main narrative remains unchanged in most contexts. Andrew Carnegie built a concert hall to share culture with the world. The fuller truth, that workers paid for that culture with their health and sometimes their lives, that the money came from industrial practices that killed people, remains supplementary information rather than central fact. Perhaps that's the best we can realistically do. Perhaps preserving buildings means accepting imperfect histories, telling what truth we can while acknowledging we can't force audiences to engage with uncomfortable realities. Perhaps we save what we can, acknowledge what we must, and live with the contradictions inherent in loving things built through exploitation. Or perhaps we're still fundamentally afraid of the fuller story because it implicates us, because we still buy tickets to performances in halls built through exploitation, because we still visit museums funded by robber barons, because we still celebrate cultural institutions without questioning too deeply where the founding money came from. We're complicit in the ongoing erasure because the alternative makes enjoying the concert harder, makes the music less pure, forces us to think about suffering while trying to experience beauty. The acoustics in Carnegie Hall remain flawless. When an orchestra performs, sound fills every corner of the auditorium with equal clarity and presence. The ceiling curve that Tuthill calculated in 1889 still works exactly as designed. Sound waves bounce off plaster, redirect through hollow chambers, emerge balanced across frequencies, creating what musicians describe as playing inside a perfectly tuned instrument. Every note resonates. Every phrase feels alive. Every dynamic shift communicates clearly to every seat. Audiences describe the experience as transcendent, as though the music exists independent of any human source, as though the building itself is singing. But sound doesn't exist independent of source. Every note played in Carnegie Hall carries the history of the building's creation, whether we acknowledge it or not. The workers who laid the bricks, the craftsmen who installed the oak paneling, the steel workers whose wages funded construction, the men who died during building, the homestead workers shot during strikes, the guards Carnegie hired to break unions, the philanthropist who believed generosity erased exploitation, the musicians who fought to save the building from demolition, the preservationists who raised millions for restoration. All of them are present in every performance, embedded in the architecture, woven into the acoustic properties, part of the sound whether we listen for them or not. The music contains all of it. Beauty and blood, achievement and exploitation, triumph and tragedy, legacy and cost. We can choose what we hear. We can focus only on the beauty, let the music transport us, enjoy the experience without thinking about foundations. That's a valid choice. Or we can listen more completely, hear the complexity, acknowledge that beauty and suffering aren't mutually exclusive, that buildings can be both monuments and graveyards, that history is always more complicated than the stories we prefer to tell. Stand in Carnegie Hall during a performance, close your eyes, listen. You'll hear what Tuthill designed. Perfect acoustics, flawless resonance, sound engineered with mathematical precision to move souls and transcend ordinary experience. The ceiling curve calculated in 1889 still bends sound waves exactly as intended. The hollow chambers still absorb and reflect specific frequencies. The plaster surfaces still create the warm, balanced tone that makes every performance feel intimate. But if you listen closer beneath the music, beyond the obvious beauty that fills the space, you might hear something else. The ghosts of men who built these walls, working for wages that barely fed their families, who never saw the finished product, who died before the hall opened. The echoes of furnaces burning in Pittsburgh, where Carnegie's workers produced the steel that generated the profits that funded this cultural monument, where men breathed air thick with metal dust, where temperatures near the crucibles turned summer shifts into death sentences. The whispers of workers who never saw the finished hall, who couldn't afford tickets even if they'd lived long enough, who were excluded from the beauty their labor created, who remain nameless in the official history displayed on museum walls. They're there. They've always been there, embedded in every surface, woven into the acoustic properties themselves. We just stopped listening. Or perhaps we never started. Perhaps we never wanted to hear that part of the story, because it complicated the narrative we preferred, because it made enjoying the concert harder, because acknowledging suffering while experiencing beauty creates cognitive dissonance we'd rather avoid. But they're embedded in the oak panels installed for 70 cents a day, trapped in the hollow acoustic chambers that workers built without understanding their purpose, resonating through the elliptical ceiling curve that required mathematical precision they never learned about. Every performance activates their presence, whether we acknowledge them or not. Every note makes them speak, if we're willing to listen. Every concert is also a memorial, intended or not, to the people who built this space and paid for it with their lives. The preservation of Carnegie Hall was a victory for culture over commerce, for heritage over development, for communities who organize against market forces that value profit above all else. That victory matters. It should be celebrated. It established precedents that protected hundreds of other buildings in subsequent decades. It demonstrated that culture has value, that history matters, that some things are worth saving, even when the financial calculation argues against it. But preservation was also a compromise. We saved a building without fully confronting what it represents. We protected a cultural institution without grappling honestly with the inequality that made it possible. We restored the architecture without adequately memorializing the workers who built it. We celebrated the philanthropist without properly reckoning with how he earned the money he gave away. We preserved the monument while erasing the memory of what it cost to build. That compromise continues. Carnegie Hall operates successfully. Performances sell out. Audiences appreciate the acoustics. Musicians cherish the opportunity to perform there. Critics praise its significance. The building fulfills its function beautifully. But unless we tell the complete story, unless we acknowledge the workers alongside the philanthropist, unless we honor the cost alongside the achievement, unless we include the suffering with the beauty, the building remains a monument to selective memory. It celebrates what we want to remember while erasing what we'd prefer to forget. Maybe that's the real cost of Carnegie Hall, not the $2 million Andrew Carnegie spent originally, not the $55 million restoration required, but the ongoing cost of maintaining a carefully curated memory, that philanthropy can erase exploitation, that legacy can redeem cruelty, that monuments can be separated from the blood that paid for them, that beauty exists independent of the suffering that made it possible. We preserved the hall, we restored the acoustics, we saved the building, but we never fully addressed the fundamental injustice that made it possible in the first place. The question remains, uncomfortable and unavoidable if we're honest. Was Carnegie Hall worth the price? Not the financial price, but the human cost. Was the cultural contribution sufficient to justify the working conditions that funded it? Can perfect acoustics balance the scales against workers burned in furnaces? Does a concert hall justify the deaths that occurred during construction? Can music redeem the exploitation that made it possible? These aren't rhetorical questions designed to elicit predetermined answers. They're genuine moral calculations we avoid making because the answers are uncomfortable and the implications are difficult. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Carnegie Hall isn't its acoustics or its architecture or its successful preservation. Perhaps it's simply that the building forces us to confront the contradiction between beauty and injustice, between culture and cost, between the monuments we build and the people we forget in the process of building them. The Hall doesn't resolve that contradiction. It can't. It embodies it. And every time the lights dim and the orchestra begins, every time we buy tickets and take our seats and wait for the music to start, we participate in it. We make a choice, conscious or unconscious, to focus on one truth while setting aside another. We celebrate the legacy while overlooking how it was funded. We applaud the performance while forgetting the workers who built the stage. The restoration plaques in Carnegie Hall's lobby list hundreds of donors who contributed to the 1986 renovation. Their names are engraved in marble, permanent recognition for their financial generosity, visible evidence of their cultural commitment. These plaques will last for generations, but nowhere on those walls will you find the names of the men who built the hall in 1891. No plaques honor the Italian masons who laid 4 million bricks. No marble commemorates the carpenters who installed 50,000 square feet of oak paneling. No bronze plaques recognize the workers who died during construction, whose families received $100 and a promise of silence. They were erased before the hall even opened. Their absence from the official record was always intentional. This is how history works in America, how it's always worked, how it continues to work despite occasional protests and incremental changes. We remember donors, not laborers. We celebrate philanthropists, not workers. We preserve the names of men who signed checks while forgetting the names of men who swung hammers and mixed concrete and carried materials and lost fingers and sometimes lost lives. Carnegie Hall is a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, a triumph of acoustic engineering, a cultural landmark worth preserving. It's also a perfect example of Gilded Age erasure, of how wealth buys not just buildings but narratives, not just monuments but memory, not just legacy but historical revision. The building stands. The men who built it are gone. Even their ghosts have been plastered over, painted over, polished away in restoration after restoration. But erasure isn't permanent. It's a choice we make repeatedly, a decision we enact every time we tell the story, without including all its characters, every time we celebrate achievement without acknowledging cost. Stories can be recovered, names can be restored. The fuller history of Carnegie Hall exists in archives, wage records, accident reports, union documents, newspaper accounts, family stories passed down through generations of workers' descendants. It's just never been prioritized because including it complicates the narrative we prefer. The narrative we prefer is simpler, cleaner, more comfortable, better suited for promotional materials and fundraising appeals. A generous industrialist recognizes his moral duty. He builds a concert hall to share culture with the masses. He hires a brilliant architect who creates acoustic perfection. Great musicians perform. Audiences appreciate beauty. The building endures. That story is true. It's also profoundly incomplete. The complete story includes the workers. It includes Homestead. It includes the 12-hour shifts in 130-degree heat. It includes the wages that barely sustained life. It includes the deaths and injuries and destroyed health. It includes the strikes and the violence and the hired guns. It includes the fundamental contradiction of a man who wrote about moral duty while treating workers as expendable components in profit generation. It includes the fact that Carnegie Hall was built with profits extracted from men who would never be able to afford a ticket to hear Tchaikovsky conduct, who were excluded from the beauty their labor funded. Can we hold both truths simultaneously? Can we appreciate Carnegie Hall's architectural achievement while condemning the system that made it possible? Can we celebrate its preservation while mourning the workers who were never preserved in memory? Can we enjoy performances while acknowledging their human cost? Or must we choose one narrative over the other, one truth instead of the complete truth? These questions determine what we pass forward to future generations, what lessons they learn from history, how they understand the relationship between wealth and culture, between exploitation and beauty, between monuments and memory. Carnegie Hall turns 133 years old. It has hosted thousands of performances, some of the greatest musical moments in history, concerts that defined careers and shaped cultural memory. It has inspired countless musicians, delighted millions of audience members, established standards for acoustic excellence that newer venues still struggle to match. It survived threats of demolition, decades of decay, and constant pressure from New York's relentless real estate development. It stands as proof that cultural landmarks can be preserved if enough people fight for them, if communities organize, if musicians advocate, if politicians support, if donors contribute. All of this is true. None of it is the complete truth. The complete truth is harder to convey, harder to celebrate, harder to market, harder to use in fundraising materials or tourist promotions. It requires us to acknowledge that America's greatest cultural achievements often rest on foundations of exploitation, that beauty has frequently been built through suffering, that monuments can simultaneously honor achievement and erase cost. It requires us to remember the workers alongside the industrialists, to calculate human cost as well as financial budgets, to ask uncomfortable questions about who benefits from beauty and who pays for it. These are the calculations we'd rather avoid. They complicate enjoyment. They introduce discomfort into experiences designed to transcend ordinary concerns. They force us to think about suffering while trying to experience beauty. They make it harder to simply appreciate perfect acoustics without considering what that perfection cost in human terms. But they're also the calculations that matter most if we want to understand history honestly, if we want to remember completely, if we want to build a future that values human dignity as much as it values cultural achievement. So here's what remains after 133 years. A building on 57th Street with perfect acoustics, meticulously maintained terracotta ornaments, gleaming oak paneling, and a history we've chosen to simplify for ease of celebration. Inside, orchestras still play every week. Outside, tourists still photograph the facade. Above it all, the elliptical ceiling still captures every sound, holds notes in perfect suspension, releases them to the furthest balcony with undiminished clarity, exactly as William Tuthill designed in 1889. The building works, the acoustics persist, the music endures, the legacy continues. But so do the questions, unanswered and unavoidable. How many lives does beauty cost? How many workers' hands shape these walls? How many names were forgotten so one man's name could be carved in marble? How much suffering sits beneath this polished wood? How much blood funded this perfect sound? How long can we celebrate monuments while ignoring the cost of building them? Carnegie Hall doesn't answer these questions. It can't. Buildings don't speak except through what we choose to tell about them. The hall just stands there, magnificent and complicit, beautiful and terrible, achievement and erasure combined in brick and terracotta and oak, a monument to both human capability and human cruelty. We saved it. We restored it. We celebrated it. We filled it with music and audiences and continued legacy, but we never fully reckoned with it. We never told the complete story. And until we do, the ghosts remain embedded in the walls, present in every performance, waiting for the moment when we're finally ready to hear what's always been there. Perhaps that's what the perfect acoustics were always designed to do, though Tuthill couldn't have known it. Capture everything, hold it forever, wait for the moment when we're finally ready to listen to all of it. The music, certainly, but also the cost. The beauty, absolutely, but also the blood. The triumph, yes, but also the truth we've been avoiding for 133 years. The hall is still standing. The acoustics are still perfect. The performances continue. The question is whether we're finally brave enough to hear what it's been saying all along.